Good morning. I'm Jen O'Brien with Hawks Learning, and today is the second and final day of the Innovative Educator Summit. Happy St. Patrick's Day, and welcome to those of you joining for the first time. For those of you joining from yesterday, I hope you found the sessions enjoyable and informative, and we're glad to have you back. I'd like to take a moment again to express our sincere appreciation for all of the speakers presenting today and yesterday. Thank you for joining us to share your expertise and experience. We truly appreciate all of your participation in this event. As a reminder, sessions will be recorded, and we will send out information on how to access those recordings after the conference. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce today's keynote speaker, Gino Perrotte. He is the founder, lead educator, coach, and mentor of Right Brain Journeys. As an award-winning expert in culture and in communication, Gino draws upon more than 2 decades of corporate management, learning and development, academic research, and teaching experience to make business and professional communication both accessible and actionable for individuals and organizations. Gino's success transcends cultures and industries and is anchored in his ability to relate, empathize, and connect on a human-to-human level. Gino is a published author, has earned a bachelor's degree in business management from Grove City College, and has earned a master's degree in interpersonal communication from University of Central Florida. Gino, thank you for joining today, and I will let you take it from here.
Jen, thanks so much for that introduction. Nice to meet everybody today. I'm excited to be joining you. In addition to all of my work as a coach and a consultant, I have been teaching at some of the largest and most prestigious universities for over a decade now. So I can speak with experience from my time at Columbia University, the Fashion Institute of Technology, Baruch College, and the University of Central Florida, that our role of educators is more complex than ever, right? We are friends, we are confidants, we are coaches, we are mentors. And I, like many of you, I love the work that I do. And yet, as it becomes increasingly vast and large, the amount of expectations, the energy only goes so far. So how can we continue loving the work that we do, deliver quality work without sacrificing ourselves in the process? That's really what I want to speak with you today about. So I'm going to be talking about this topic of being able to address burnout and quiet quitting through sustainable approaches to teaching and learning. And this really comes back to questioning academic rigor. So in this process today, what I'm going to be doing over the next 30 some minutes is defining some things with you to start. So I'm going to be talking about defining sustainability and rigor, introducing a term that's been very popular in the last year that you might have heard of, and that's quiet quitting. So we'll dive into that a bit. Then we'll move into burnout and get a definition from leading researchers on that topic. And then finally, we'll move into 7 tips that have been very successful for me over the last decade in my classrooms to really make my teaching sustainable and help make learning sustainable for my students. So I look forward to spending this time with you. Feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat. At the end, we're going to have 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A, and our Hawks team of Jen and Schreiber will be moderating that for us. So I appreciate their help with it. Okay, so here we go. Let's start with the definition. We're going to dive into sustainability. And when I think of sustainability, I'm really looking at our role as educators as being more marathon than a sprint. So I'm not in this for a year, not particularly teaching just one class every now and then as an adjunct, but this is a career. So that needs to be sustainable. We don't want to burn ourselves out by running this sprint and going all out. We have to pace ourselves. So anyone who's ever trained for a marathon understands that process of pacing yourself for the longer journey ahead. So thinking about sustainability in that metaphor, then I define sustainability as teaching and learning in a way that supports our energy, it supports our relationships, and it supports our feelings of productivity and our feelings of achievement. So we'll continue to come back to that definition of sustainability as we go on. And in order to teach and learn in a sustainable way, of course, we know that you can't teach the same because contexts change. So in this definition of sustainability, I want us to consider contexts. And I'll just introduce 3. There can be way more than these, but 3 that I come into contact frequently with would be class size. Can you realistically teach the same thing in the same way for a small, medium, and large class size? I've discovered likely no, you can't teach everything the same way. So we have to consider class size. The second thing we have to consider will be teaching modalities. And the three ones that I've taught at, so I know these are common ones and many of you have likely taught this way as well. They would be teaching in person, teaching hybrid, so part in person, part online, and then teaching fully online. And anyone who's taught both in person and online, you know that that is not the same experience. Teaching a 3-hour course in person is energetically not the same as teaching a 3-hour class online. And there's even a term to describe that, which is Zoom fatigue. So having to consider the context of our modalities will shift the degree of potential burnout. And then that comes into this larger picture of what I'm talking about, which is sustainability. So how do we consider the context of modality to make our teaching and learning more sustainable? And then the last one, this is one that I wouldn't have thought of when I first started teaching. I discovered this through my experience and through the conversations and feedback from students over years. And that is the context of emotional work. Some assignments are more heady, where it's more cognitive processing, and others really guide students into connecting their head with their heart, which is really the foundational work of what I do with my consulting of Right Brain Journeys. But that means that in addition to engaging your head, there's a lot of deep emotional work involved. So as a quick example, since we're still in the introduction phase here with definitions, one of my courses is gender communication. And in that course, we help students make a lot of unconscious connections to the way our cultures have taught us how to be able to identify for gender and then be able to perform our gender. And this means that there is a lot of deep reflective work. So students over the years have given me feedback that this reflective work can bring them to emotional spaces that it takes extra energy to explore that than just doing an outline for a speech, for example. So you have to consider this level of energetic input, the depth of processing that's involved in the emotional work as a context. So all of that is to define sustainability. The takeaway again, what is sustainability? It supports our energy, our relationships, and our feelings of achievement and productivity. The next definition that I want to get into is defining rigor. And Dr. Amy Smith, who is a Chief Learning Officer of Straightliner, which is a student success and college readiness company, points out that faculty and students often have a different view of what rigor is, which doesn't surprise me, but you'll see why I'm smiling in just a moment. Faculty define rigor as quality with high expectations, where students tend to think of rigor as quantity and the question, of course, how much work am I going to have to do? That's not necessarily an inappropriate question from a student perspective, because just as the role of educators is becoming more complex, over the last decade, I've also seen the role of students become more and more complex, where they're taking more classes, trying to finish sooner to minimize debt, and they're trying to get that full-time job sooner so they can not only minimize debt, but increase income sooner. So they're having a higher course load, plus they're working part-time, or now I'm teaching in New York City. A lot of my students are full-time students and full-time workers. So they're really burning the candle at both ends. So this idea of how much work am I going to have to do can be a legitimate question, and that's something students are considering with rigor. So Dr. Smith defines it as 3 pieces: course challenge plus learning support plus design. And it's that last component of Dr. Smith's definition, design, that I'm going to focus here during this keynote for us. And the reason is that's where the 7 tips come in. That's really where we hold the most power as educators, is being able to design courses for our students that will help them learn with rigor. Okay, so let's really get the perspective here with the focus on working smarter and not harder in terms of rigor. So Dr. Smith also notes this about rigor, and I'm going to quote, so I'm going to read here for just a moment here so I get this correct. Dr. Smith says, quote, "This means providing high levels of support and good course design for a course that is particularly challenging." Here's where I want us to focus. Or reducing the workload of a course if its design is lower quality and forces learners to invest more time to understand the material. So what I love about this definition is the focus on rigor can sometimes be about reducing the workload. For some of you, you already get this. This isn't earth-shattering, but I know I've worked with colleagues at several different universities that are under a belief system that their course is rigorous if it's jam-packed with a ton of assignments, that somehow all of that work makes their course better. And it might or it might not. And Dr. Smith's definition really underscores for us that distinction of it might and it might not. Okay, so here's why that can matter, the amount of coursework. And that leads us into our next definition, and that's looking at burnout. And I'm going to share some burnout research with you from Christina Masloch, who's a professor of psychology emerita at University of California, Berkeley, and her co-author, Michael Leiter, who's a professor of organizational psychology at Deakin University in Australia. So they define burnout by 3 dimensions in their 2022 book, so their 2022 book, The Burnout Challenge. Excellent book, highly recommend it. The 3 dimensions that they define in their book are exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. So a quick bird's eye view of this, of course, we're going to look at those over the next couple minutes so you understand what each of those dimensions are, because they will be tied into the 7 ideas to help us streamline that I will finish with for us today. But to zoom in, all 3 of those dimensions they've discovered through their research, all 3 need to be present for burnout to actually happen. So keep that in mind as we work through the definition for each of these. Okay, so the first one, exhaustion. Exhaustion is when people feel overwhelmed by work demands, they feel depleted, and they feel drained of necessary resources. So this, I'm sure, is an experience that you've had at least once as a teacher. If you'd like to share that in the chat, feel free to go ahead and do that. I've experienced this often on my really busy teaching days. Sometimes my schedules will be from 9 in the morning till 5:30 at night with office hours in the middle. So I am teaching or in office hours nonstop all day. And I come home exhausted by that definition. I don't want to talk to anybody else. I don't want to engage with anybody else. I just want to shower, eat, and sit on my couch, watch some TV, and just kind of, veg out. So that's exhaustion. And it's not uncommon in service professions like teaching. That alone, though, isn't necessarily a problem. And I'll mention that why coming up next, as we move into the definition of the second dimension, which is cynicism. So cynicism is a negative and overly detached response to our work. So in essence, you don't like your work and you don't want to do it. You maybe even hate your work. So when I said I'm exhausted, but that's not necessarily a bad thing about my work, that's because I'm not cynical. I love what I teach and I love working with students. So that particular dimension is not showing up in my work. So I just need to provide space for myself to be able to recover from exhaustion, which I do by sitting on my couch and vegging out. So perhaps you've developed the same type of techniques or other techniques to recover from exhaustion. But if you have exhaustion and cynicism, then you have 2 of the 3 areas already showing up towards burnout. And be aware, according to that research by Masloch and Leiter, you may be moving in that direction. So it might be time to take some intervention, which is why I'm suggesting the 7 tips to make our teaching more sustainable at the end. So here's another quote from them in their book about cynicism. If people are working too hard and doing too much, they will begin to back off, to cut down, to reduce what they are doing. And I pulled that quote out for our discussion today because that sounds a lot like the common definition of quiet quitting, that term that's been talked about in the last year, where people are doing the bare minimum of their job and not going the extra mile. So maybe this is related to the dimension of cynicism. Let's dive for just a few moments here, a little deeper into quiet quitting and see what some researchers have to say about it. So we're on the same page with what this is. So quiet quitting was discussed in a Harvard Business Review article that was published September 15th of 2022. And the title is When Quiet Quitting is Worse Than the Real Thing. This is an article by organizational behavior and international business professors, Anthony C. Klotz and Mark C. Bolino. And in the article, they define quiet quitting this way. And this is a direct quote. So again, I'm going to read it to make sure I get it correct. Quiet quitting refers to opting out of tasks beyond one's assigned duties and/or becoming less psychologically invested in work. Quiet quitters continue to fulfill their primary responsibilities, but they're less willing to engage in activities known as citizenship behaviors. No more staying late, no more showing up early, or attending non-mandatory meetings. So they're doing what they need to, but nothing extra. So this can cause some issues. The good thing is you're covering at least the core things, but you're not building a sense of connection to the teammates, which is part of what cynicism said is that you can, well, actually, I'm getting into that right after this. It can cause a problem, which I'll talk about in a few moments here, but they suggest 3 tips to be able to address this if you're a leader, but it's the last tip. It's the third and final tip that I want to share with us today because I think it's the most relevant and it touches upon this idea of sustainability and burnout being tied to that. Their third tip is less hustle, more crafting. And here's what they mean by that. This is a quote again. Leaders can retain the positive aspects of citizenship behavior without subjecting their teams to an unsustainable hustle culture. Instead of promoting an always-on mindset that ends up burning people out, leaders should encourage employees to pursue what we call citizenship crafting. So this citizenship crafting can be helpful to countering these feelings and potentially cynicism. So citizenship crafting is helping employees, quote, to determine the specific forms of citizenship that align with their intrinsic motivations and encourage workers to focus on these tasks if and when they have the bandwidth to go beyond their core job duties. So the general conclusion that I want you to realize, just to summarize that and put it back into context of our larger discussion in this keynote, is when we do citizenship behaviors that align with our intrinsic values, then we get energized by that service, by that work, instead of drained by it. So that will help counter exhaustion as well and cynicism. So getting back to the cynicism decision and why this citizenship behaviors are a good thing and why leaders want to address them is that over time with cynicism, if that's showing up for you at work, then workers can develop not only negative attitudes towards the work, but the people associated with the work. That's what was discovered in the research from Maslow and Leiter in the Burnout Challenge. So that's not good as educators, right? Because the people associated with the work are students. So if you have negative associations with the students, that's not going to create a classroom environment that's conducive to learning. It could even add additional layers of stress for the student, which makes learning more difficult and not more sustainable for them. And of course, the flow of ideas between colleagues, I mean, that's kind of where the magic at, I believe at least, is the continual learning that's offered through a collegial relationships with your colleagues. So we don't want cynicism, right? Not a good thing. It's something that we want to think about to address, which we'll touch upon when we get to the tips. So the third and final dimension of burnout discussed in the Burnout Challenge is inefficacy. And this is simply defined as when you feel powerless and lacking in achievement and productivity in your work. So in other words, you don't believe that you have the capacity to do your work well. This comes back to the idea that not only do many of us educators love our work, but it gives us a sense of pride. It gives us a sense of feeling good about what we do and making a difference in the world. So if you don't believe you're doing that, achieving those things, you're not making a difference, yeah, you're collecting a paycheck, but you're not really teaching anything that matters, then inefficacy may actually show up. So again, the real takeaway from this burnout for you is recognize that all 3 dimensions, when they show up together, that's what's going to lead you into full burnout. So I'll be bringing us very soon, like now, into the start to introducing 7 tips that will help you counter these areas that you can be aware. Before I do that, feel free to drop into the chat if you would like. Do you experience any of these factors, any of these dimensions of burnout on a regular basis? Let us know, because if so, then we'll be moving into that during the Q&A, and I really want you to listen to these tips to see how you can integrate those. Those dimensions are, again, it's going to be exhaustion, cynicism, and efficacy. Let me know if you experience any of those. Mine consistently, I've told you, is exhaustion, so I've had to develop my own techniques to keep myself physically and mentally rejuvenated so I can go back into the classroom, but also so I can have a life as an individual, have a social life, and not lock myself away all weekend just so I can manifest the energy to get back to work on Monday. So here are my ideas to help streamline the teaching and learning process that I've used in my own classrooms. Remember, sustainability, what I've defined earlier, supports our energy, supports our relationships, supports our feelings of achievement and productivity. So that's what we're hitting on. And we still, of course, have to consider those contexts in these areas that I'm going to share. So the context would be class size, modalities, and level of emotional work that could be present. Keep in mind before I present these ideas that they've worked well in my communication-focused classrooms. So these techniques may not be translatable to every subject or every modality in which you teach. That's where you come in as the expert of your world to see how you may be able to tweak. And if you have any questions about how you may be able to tweak, those are perfect for the Q&A section. So courses that I teach are things like public speaking, business and professional communication, and nonverbal communication, intercultural communication, gender, which I mentioned earlier. So again, I invite you to see how these tips may work for your classroom. We're just about to get into that. Before I do that, though, I want to have a very brief discussion because some of the tips include this, what I'm about to talk about, include this area of really getting clear for yourself and then communicating that clarity to your students about what are the responsibilities for you as the teacher and what are the responsibilities of the learner. And I think this is a very important part why I'm presenting it now before we get into these tips, because again, working for years and reflecting back upon my own former teaching styles and the styles of colleagues and the level of exhaustion and burnout and cynicism that have showed up in the past, I've discovered that a lot of colleagues and I, we were good students. A lot of teachers, we stayed in school or we got into the business of teaching school because we liked school. And we liked school probably because we did well in school. So as a result, we don't like to see people do poorly. We don't like to see Fs, even when it's as great a student earned. We don't like to see students making mistakes. We are wanting people to do their best, right? In some ways, we're cheerleaders in that way as well. So that's another thing we should add to what's making our role of educators more complex. We're mentors, we're confidants, we're friends, we're coaches, and we're cheerleaders as well. But what I've seen colleagues do is because they don't like seeing Fs, even when it's not their F, they will, instead of holding students accountable to what their role is, they'll take on some of that role. Here's a quick example so it's clear what I'm talking about. Again, I've done some of these behaviors in the past. I no longer do this, and I'll tell you why, because I'm teaching my students to be responsible for what they are responsible for. With online courses, we design an online course, we build a course schedule. The course schedule has every assignment, every due date. On day one, students see how to walk through that course schedule. They have that at a glance. They know what's due and when for the whole semester. So I give it to them on day one and it doesn't change. Then we give weekly announcements. Hey, coming up this week, either in the classroom or if it's online teaching, I'll post a beginning of the week announcement. Hey, everybody, reminder, here's what's coming up this week. Here's the topics. Here are the assignments covered. Here's the due dates. Then they have drop boxes to submit the assignments, which also list the due dates. So in the past, when I've worked at another university, some of my colleagues would talk about how then the day of the assignment, when it's due, they would also go into the grade column and they showed us how you can click and do a send reminder to those students who have not yet submitted their assignment. So my colleagues were then going in and also reminding those students who were waiting to the last minute, hey, don't forget you have an assignment. And they justified that with good intentions. They have a good heart, right? They want to help the students, remember. They don't want them to miss something that they may get a 0 on. But two, they have said that it saved on the back end a lot of emails. Hey, professor, making excuses up as to why they missed it when they saw they got a 0. So that was the intention. And for a while, I did that as well. What I found for me is that there were still some students who still didn't turn in the assignment, which means I still got some emails that I had to answer afterwards as to, hey, professor, I wasn't feeling well, that kind of stuff. So in other words, I still had extra work to do because the student didn't turn their assignment in on time. However, what I've really discovered long-term is, what am I teaching these students? I'm teaching them that they're not responsible for remembering what they actually are responsible for remembering. I'm so hyper responsible as the teacher, because I was a good student, like many of us were, that I start to take on their role of remembering what they're supposed to remember. And that's when I stopped that several years ago. Not my job anymore. I told you 3 different ways. I told you on the beginning schedule. I told you in the weekly announcement before we started the work for this week. And then it's in the Dropbox. Like you need to know this stuff. So it reduces the workload for me, one, which starts to counter some of that exhaustion because it takes work off of my plate. And then 2, it's really teaching. I'm teaching students to be responsible for what they need to be responsible for. And if they get a 0, that's a good learning lesson. If they don't like a 0, then they better learn a better way to remember what's necessary for them. And that's really the takeaway, is they're going to be responsible for themselves as soon as they leave my classroom or leave college. So if they haven't yet developed a system to remember what they need to get done, they need to figure that out, and soon. So I'm sheltering them by taking on their responsibility. Okay, so that's what I'm getting into. So let's move next. You may discover when you do this, by the way, that it is the first time a teacher has ever really been that clear with students. And I say that because I've gotten that feedback over the year as to how I'm so organized. I provide everything up front for the student. So not a lot of teachers apparently are doing this, getting really clear. Here's what I'm responsible for as the teacher, and here's where you have to pick up your piece of this complementary relationship we have together. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into a concept called uncertainty reduction theory. And this is the last thing before we move into our 7 tips. So it's building into these tips. The reason we want to be really clear communicators about expectations and directions, which we'll get into the tips with students, is tied back to something called uncertainty reduction theory, which is a big thing we discuss in our field of interpersonal communication. Essentially, what this theory says is people don't like to be uncertain. When we don't know what's coming up next, it can trigger anxiety. Anxiety doesn't feel good. Human beings want to feel good. So we start gathering data so that we can be more certain, which will then lower the uncertainty, which will then lower the anxiousness, and we end up feeling better. So the interesting thing about this happens somewhere in the middle, which is the information gathering part. The fascinating thing is that human beings will start gathering information, whether they know it to be true or not. They realize, this may not actually be the truth, but at least it's information. We would rather proceed with information that we realize may be false than proceed with knowing nothing at all. So we'd rather know the wrong thing than know nothing at all. Isn't that interesting? So knowing this as teachers, one of our responsibilities, going back to that list, what's responsible for us and what are these learners responsible for? Well, clearly on our side as teachers, we are responsible for helping the students have correct, truthful, accurate information to reduce their uncertainties about how to perform in this class, what they're going to learn when things are due. So you need to have a clear syllabus, you need to have a clear schedule, you need to have clear office hours, you need to have clear directions, things like that. That's our responsibility. Okay, let's go ahead and move into these 7 tips, really focusing on the rigor part of smart design, back to Dr. Smith's definition, that 3rd component of her definition, smart design. As a quick aside, why am I sharing these tips? Well, I've won several teaching awards in the past, and I've been teaching for over a decade now. I consistently get high evaluations, both from my colleagues, my peer evaluations, as well as my students. So I say that as evidence that I'm doing something right in the classrooms. So these are my tips that have worked for me. And again, consider your own personal context, because these may not translate to every situation. Okay, the first one. Can you create workshops in your classrooms? So this is something that I started to do in my public speaking classes, because at one of the universities I worked, we had 30 students in a speech classroom, which is abnormally high. Most colleges are somewhere around 25, which is also a lot to manage, but 30 is a lot. It's a sprint that you constantly have to do. You're running a marathon at a sprint pace at that. So not sustainable. That was my experience when working at that particular place. But anyway, I had to learn to deal with that because I couldn't change the class size, right? I was given that, how to deal with it. So I had to develop pedagogy to be able to support the class size without burning myself out. Here's how I did that. We have a graded assignment like an informative speech, which is a larger assignment. It's worth 100 points, and students are given an A, B, C, D, F, depending on their delivery of that speech. But in order to do an informative speech, there are smaller pieces, smaller assignments that build into that. There's an outline that we do, and then there are slides, like PowerPoint slides, that they'll use to deliver the speech with. So this idea of can you create workshops? This was making the outline into a workshop and making the PowerPoint slides into a workshop. And they became pass-fail. So I assigned about 10 points for each of those. Such a small portion of the overall 100 points that they would have to earn for delivering the speech. So it's a pass-fail opportunity. That did several things for me. Since they happened in the classroom, I broke them into groups of about 4 or 5. They sat in a circle with their group and they passed their outlines around. So it did a couple things. One, for me, in terms of exhaustion, that dimension of burnout, it reduced the time because I was teaching like 4 of these. So that's 120 outlines in 1 week on top of teaching 4 classes. That's not sustainable. So I didn't have to grade at home. That saved me a lot of time for both the slides and the PowerPoint. It also gives the students the benefit of having multiple eyes on the outlines in the PowerPoint slides. So they're able to get a better chance of people spotting corrections. And then most interestingly is that it really allowed me to assess whether or not the students truly understood how to do an effective outline and effective PowerPoint slides. And I say this because it was listening to their comments when they were teaching their peers about what they saw, the corrections in the other person's outline. That's how I knew that they knew. So of course, my responsibility before breaking into these workshops was to give clear directions so they knew what an effective outline is and what to do during the workshop. But it saved me a lot of time. The second tip builds in that, and I kind of already described it, but it's specifically called scaffolding of assignments. And that's when you take something larger like that informative speech and you break it down into smaller achievable steps, like the outline, then the slides that build into it. So I also do a LinkedIn profile project for my business communication class. They have a final project to have a complete and robust LinkedIn profile, which is a lot of deliverables in that. So I break it down into a bio for the first assignment, which has a lot of instructions. Then we do the midterm, which is then building about 10 components on your profile. So they have a profile picture that supports the bio appropriately, something like job experience, education, those kind of stuff. So then they get feedback, they can make any fixes that I recommend. And then the bigger stuff is due at the end of the semester where they get recommendations, they have to write an article. So benefits to this by breaking this down into 3 smaller things is 1, it addresses the potential inefficacy dimension of burnout because it's achievable smaller steps. So I'm giving students ways to experience success, which will help them build self-efficacy. And then it can combat the exhaustion dimension by not making the projects feel so large. And PS, I'm forcing them to work on it at intervals and they can't save it for the last minute like some students do and try to do this massive project in 2 days and get 0 sleep as they finish it. So that's a technique that can work for those. The third one is Google Forms. Can you use Google Forms to make it easy to grade all of your student submissions at a single glance? Before you get into this one, though, you should definitely check with your administration, your department. Not every college gives permission to use outside platforms like Google. Mine does. So how I've used this effectively is in one of my courses, Intercultural Communication, I do a weekly survey that goes along with the course topic for the week, the material for the week. And it'll be just 5 points, 5 questions, 1 point per question, but it's getting student perspectives on the topic. So perhaps it's one of the topics was talking about how culture teaches us what food is appropriate to eat at certain times of the day. What's for breakfast was the topic. So in some cultures, you eat what we consider to be dinner food in the US. So I'll ask the students, what do you eat for breakfast? Another question would be, what stereotypes have you experienced based off of your culture? Then Google Forms, for every student submission in the form, on the back end where I see it as the grader is in an Excel spreadsheet. So one column I see their names, another column I see their answers for what's for breakfast, and another column I see the stereotype answers. So I can quickly grade across. It makes it so easy and fast to grade, saves me a lot of time, saves me energy, but also pedagogically what's cool about this is that I get to compare and contrast super easy. I can spot patterns and trends because I see all the answers in the columns. So consider if this will work for you. Okay, the next one, prepare documents for each assignment with frequently used feedback. So I do this when I'm grading speeches. I'll open up a Word doc when I start grading a speech and I'll make comments to the student. I take those comments, paste it into the Word doc, obviously without any names, so it's anonymous. And then when I start noticing around speech number 8 is that I keep making the same compliments, here's what you're doing well, and the same corrections, here's what you need to fix. And then if I have 30 speeches to grade, which is common, that saves me a lot of time. Plus, again, pedagogically, the positive thing is on the back end, I get to come back into this and I have a list now to inform my future teaching. Because if there's consistently the same things that they're doing wrong, that means I'm not teaching that effectively and I need to update my pedagogy. So it's a very effective tool, I find. Number 5, make your directions clear. Goes back to uncertainty reduction theory. I've already kind of touched upon this, but get feedback each semester from your students, whether informally in class, just asking them for feedback on the directions for the assignment, or formally, you can put it at an end of class survey. Get that feedback and then update your directions each semester based off of that. Number 6, map each assignment to a specific learning objective. This is called curriculum mapping, and it's really helpful. So curriculum mapping, you'll get your course description and often your learning objectives from your department. Then you will start building your pedagogy. We start plugging in readings and lectures and assignments. But most of us, I've found, never actually map our readings, lectures, learning assignments back to our objectives. In other words, we're trying to spot busy work. Have I given students work to do that's not really helping them develop any learning objective? And if the answer to that is yes, I need to eliminate those busy assignments because it goes along with good rigor, which is not giving them just a ton of work to do for the sake of having work. It needs to be tied to a specific pedagogical reason. And curriculum mapping helps us spot that. Okay, I have one more tip. We're getting to Q&A soon. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about making at least 50% of the responsibility, making it clear that at least 50% is on the student for their learning journey. I discovered that I needed to do this special tip that I'm sharing with you when I was working at one of the largest universities in the country, where my speech classes were 30. When I was teaching upper division undergrad classes like intercultural, I often had 45 students in a class with no TA. So you multiply that by 4 students and wow, it's a lot, right? So what I discovered is that I needed to make my office hours into 15-minute coaching sessions. And you can use something like Calendly, which is a scheduler. And Calendly will give your students the ability to see your availability on a calendar, book a time, a date. If you want to do it virtually, you can automatically set up a virtual link for them. Or of course, they can just reserve the time and come to your office. So why did I do this? Because I discovered when I was teaching that my students who were the lowest performing, getting D's and F's, they had the most corrections on their assignments when they turned them in. So I spent the most time giving very detailed feedback at the beginning of my career, saying, you know, these students really need help in order to improve. Then the large majority of those underperforming students never implemented the feedback in the next semester. So it wasn't that they really didn't know, it's that they weren't putting in the effort and they didn't care to put in the effort. But that's where I was spending most of my time, was with the students who didn't care. Meanwhile, my students who were getting A's, they came to my office hours anyway, because they got a 94 and now they wanted to know how they could get a 98. They were my overperforming students. And I really realized that the joy in teaching for me, which can counter the cynicism and the exhaustion part, the joy for me is helping people learn, whether they're low performing students or overperforming students. So the responsibility is, I will give you very detailed, customized, personalized, one-on-one feedback, but it's not going to be written on your document. You're going to have to see me during office hours, and I will be thrilled to spend that time with you. So that really freed up a lot of my time with grading. Of course, I give them feedback, but it's a lot of that cut and paste general comments. And then it's followed up by an invitation, book an appointment, come and see me during office hours for individualized feedback. Those that care will take the responsibility on to come and learn from you. It saved me a ton of time and energy and makes my teaching more sustainable. Okay, before we go into Q&A, one more quick tip. And this goes back to what our discussion on quiet quitting was, and it talked about citizenship crafting. And citizenship crafting for yourself is becoming aware of your own intrinsic motivators. So if you decide to go above and beyond with any additional duties, you're going to align it with your intrinsic motivations. How do you start to find your intrinsic motivations? Once we get to Q&A, I'm going to drop this link in the chat. It's a free survey from the VIA Character Strength Survey, the Values in Action. And it's the only free, this is from their description, it's the only free scientific survey of character strengths in the world. It takes about 10 minutes to complete. Research shows that knowing and using your character strengths can help you do 5 things. Increase happiness and well-being, find meaning and purpose, boost relationships, manage stress, and accomplish goals. Okay, in 60 seconds or less, our recap, and then we got Q&A. We've talked about sustainability. We defined rigor. We defined quiet quitting. We talked about sustainable teaching, supporting your relationships, your energy, your feelings of achievement and productivity. We discovered that faculty and students have different views of rigor. Students see rigor as quantity and how much work am I going to have to do. Faculty see it more about quality and high expectations. The official Dr. Smith definition for rigor is course challenge plus learning support plus design. I talked about 3 factors of burnout, exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. Then I offered these 7 tips to help streamline the teaching and learning process that has helped me in my classroom. So consider whether or not it'll work for you, and remember contexts like class size, modalities, and the level of immersion work. I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn. You see my name here in the corner, Gino Perrotte, and I'm happy to answer any questions. So Jen and Shriver, Q&A.
Thanks so much, Gino. That was incredibly informative and helpful. We got lots of engagement with the audience. So we'll start with the first question here. It feels like the requirements of research, scholarship, and service really pulls away valuable energy that I could use to enhance my teaching further. Yeah. Service is the part of the job that energizes me. Yeah. Any suggestions for juggling these 3 responsibilities without experiencing burnout, especially in regards to teaching?
Sure. It could be a job fit, meaning I'm a lecturer, so I've strategically chosen that role. I'm not a professor. I have 0 research requirements and 90% is on teaching. So the service that I choose is very much about citizenship behaviors. It's service that serves my soul, which for me, it's working directly with the students. I choose not to sit on committees. I choose to be one-on-one serving student groups. So the first thing is to actually look at your responsibility would be my suggestion. If you're a professor, then you have agreed when you accepted that role to a certain ratio. And that is because that role that you're currently occupying serves larger university goals. Perhaps it's grants and funding, right? So consider whether or not you may be in not the best fit. Maybe you actually want to be a lecturer, for example. So since you have the huge benefit and insight that you know what makes you happy. P.S. A lot of adults don't know that, right? So you're one of the lucky ones. You know what makes you happy. Now it's about, can I craft that in my current role? Or may I have to pivot to a different role in this organization? So maybe to a lecturer role. That would be my general, but feel free to connect with me because I would love to keep talking about that. If we have other questions, I want to make sure we have time to get to them. If not, I'll spend more time there. But feel free to connect.
Great advice. We do have a few more, so I'll move on to the next. Someone asked if they could get the title of the reading that you had mentioned about Burnout Challenge, in particular, more reading that clarifies the always on versus citizenship crafting.
Yeah, absolutely. Will I be able to share that with you, Jen? And you can put it.
You can share it with us. I know that we'll be posting the recording. One person also did ask about if they can get all of this information you've shared in a digital version. We are recording, so we will post it on our website. Chances are we can probably post what that article there as well. If not, we'll find a way to distribute it.
Yeah, and I'm happy to share with the Hawks team the script, so it has that. The book, I'm going to also put in, I'm just typing in the chat, make sure this doesn't go, I'm going to put it to everyone. This is the VIA character survey they talked about, that free character survey. I'm not associated with this organization, by the way, so I'm only promoting it because I really like it. It's free to register. I'm sure they collect your data. I might be wrong about that, but it will be a free survey if you register. The Burnout Challenge is a 2022 book. I have it out of reach. I can see it. It's on my bookshelf, but I'll disappear if I reach over and grab it for you. But it's by Christina Masloch and Michael Leiter, 2002 book called The Burnout Challenge. The other article on quiet quitting, this was for the citizenship crafting. It's a September 15th, 2022 HBR, Harvard Business Review, called When Quiet Quitting is Worse Than the Real Thing. So you can Google that. Anthony Klotz, Michael Bolino.
Perfect. Thank you. And I think we can sneak in one last question. Somebody asked, how can faculty get leadership on board when you go above and beyond and all it accomplishes is leadership continues to expect more and more?
Yes. Okay. I so feel this person. I left one of my jobs for that reason. I had to take responsibility for myself. I'm not telling you leave. So let's just say that was the choice that was best for me that I concluded was the first thing I ask is, who are you doing this service for? What I often find with teachers is we have such kind, giving hearts. I don't know any teacher who went into teaching to get rich because it doesn't happen. We go into teaching because we love the work that we do, we love learning, and we love the students. So what I often find this as is, and I'm not saying this is malicious, and this is my language with my experience, I find that some leadership can weaponize that against us, meaning when budget cuts really started happening big time in 2008, where I was teaching, there was a general, leadership never said this, but the faculty made this general culture of, we can't let the students suffer, there's not enough resources. So the faculty started to take on and fill the missing gaps. And the big aha moment, because I did burn out, and that's why I needed to leave that organization. The big aha moment for me was I realized I love these students, but they are not my students, meaning they belong to the university first. If I would die tomorrow, the class will be filled because they belong to the university. So the university has the first line of responsibility to make sure that the students get access to what they need. And if the university's not fulfilling that mission, as harsh as this sound, I need to let the system self-correct. I cannot be the safety net that catches it, because if I do, the system will never self-correct. So if it needs to fail, it needs to fail, because the system is not sustainable if you are the one as the teacher patching the plugs in the sinking ship. We don't need to get new leadership if the leadership isn't failing, because we're saving them.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Gino. That was incredible. Really appreciate your time today. I know that Shriver had shared a few of the items you had mentioned as well in the chat to give people that additional information.
Perfect.
And with that, we'll go ahead and shift on to talk about the first concurrent sessions of the day. They will begin this morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can view the chat for session meeting room links or access the conference website for a complete list of concurrent sessions and their descriptions. While accessing the conference website, please do swing by the virtual exhibit hall to say hi to the Hawks team. While there, you can view a quick 5-minute demonstration, request a free t-shirt, and be entered to win a $50 hourly giveaway. Also, in the spirit of St. Patrick's Day, you'll find a few golden coins throughout the conference website. You can click on the coins to be entered to win an additional raffle, and we will see everyone at the next session.
So much fun. That's great. I love that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Gino.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.